Hi everyone, my name is James Blackwell. I'm a research fellow here at the Bell School. I'm just here to kind of kick things off. Thank you all for coming and also to introduce Paul House. Before I start though, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. I know many of us are following the US election race. I promise I'm coming back to do the Q&A at the end. I will update you in an hour. If you can all put your phones away for 60 minutes, I promise you I will tell you if any states have changed in the next 60 minutes. I will check my phone so you don't have to. But now that's out of the way, I'd like to introduce Paul House, who's a senior Ngambri custodian here in Canberra, one of the traditional owners, and he's going to give a welcome to country here. Thank you.
Mandangu, Wurugawuri, thank you, James, and Yari Marang, Jumburuburu Marambang Maranya Mayin. Good afternoon, everyone. Yinjamadabala, Dr. Sheryl Lightfoot, my respects to Sheryl. Yinjamadabala, Helen, Julian, James, academics. Yuandu, Paul Girawa House. My name is Paul Girawa House. Nadu Maradu Mare Biringu, Gujigangu, Ngambri, Nurumbangu, Murrumaginya. I was born here at the centre of my ancestral country, at the old Canberra Hospital. Wirai Nyang, Wirai Mayin, no language, no people. Wallawin Mayin, Wallawin Nurumbango. Healthy people, healthy country. Yilangalangbu, Gibabango, Wogabu, Megabu, Didanilbang Mayin. Nyarin Jamali, Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wallabaloa, Nunu, Nagarigo, Waradri, Mujigang, Yanangbu, Jayandu. Ngambri, Cambri, Wogalu, Wallabaloa, Nunua, Mayin, Gain, Banya, Ninyoga, Nurumbango Dara. Noya Goyamalang, Marambangmalang, it's wonderful. It's beautiful to be here. Nina Nain Muraburumba Bira Gawayambana Nina Nurumbango to support Dr. Sheryl here in her visit and her speech. Nadu Wurugabigi Balabambo Gubu, Balagibang Gubu, Goingolela, Dumbalina Murway Marambo. We listen to the old people, the ancestors, the elders, and they show us the good path, the right path, the straight path. Goingolela, Bilangali now, Yamamali now, Wallamali now, they nurture us, they guide us, they protect us. Mamba wara na minyago, wuragabinya wuradaraigo, winingalago baligo, looking to see, listening to hear, and learning to understand. Nyani injamali nurabangila balanin walawin, galanga bangbo yaningingo nyani mawang yao biligi gila, yamumbel giri yani marambo, bagarigan yaningingo. We look after country, so it is. We respect country, we look after country, so it is healthy for our children, and we teach and we learn what is right for all on country. Murumuginya Yinjamara, Murumuru Wirimbira Nurambango. Living a respectful way of life, cares for country. Yinjamara Wirimbira, Marandogobo, Giiragobo, Yandogobo. Respect is taking responsibility for the now, the past, the present, and the future. Murubango Bala, Winganagu, Yambo Wan Bango Nara Nara. First to know the nature of things, Helen. Our motto here in language from Latin. And Wirai, the language here on country, all the old people were multilingual. They spoke all the languages of the region. And so we acknowledge the power of language on country. Language is free. Language comes from Mother Earth. No one owns language. And we all have a responsibility to share language with everyone on country. And with that, our welcome to countries are made in the spirit of peace, harmony and reconciliation for all people of modern Australia. Our main aim as local custodians is always to establish an atmosphere of mutual respect through the acknowledgement of our ancestors and the recognition of our rights to declare our special place in the pre and post history of the Canberra region. The name Canberra is derived from the name of our people and country here, the Ngambri, Cambri, Canberra. We're actually Wogalu speaking people, multilingual speakers from country. And we've cared for Mother Earth since the dawn of time, and evidence of our occupation, our ownership, our sovereignty can be seen everywhere throughout the country, the land. And like our North American brothers and sisters, our old people never gave this country up, never ceded sovereignty. Our land was stolen without consent or treaty, and we've never been compensated for these losses on our country. And we continue the fight for justice and our human rights every day here through the whitefellow judicial system and the bureaucracy. So with that, Maragaladal, Wallan Mayan, Mayan Galang, we hold fast to each other, we empower the people, Wallangun mala mara mara gurai, we be brave, make change. Diriyawana murawara, na one better, we get up, we stand up and we show up. Yinja Marabala Nama, Dr. Matilda Williams House, I'd like to pay my respects to my mother. She's the first Indigenous Australian to be awarded an honorary doctorate here from the ANU in 2017. And 2 years ago, she was awarded the Senior National NAIDOC Female Elder of the Year. My mother was a 2006 Canberra Citizen of the Year, and she done the first ever Welcome to Country at the 42nd opening of Federal Parliament, and the 43rd and the 44th. And we were gifted that opportunity at the 47th. And we don't take these opportunities for granted because we know politicians come and go, and so do they're bureaucrats. So we're able to share when we can and where we can on country. So mara mara, nyi nyi girama maranya. Respect shapes us, lifts up the people. Mara mara, winanga gigalana mai, and respect creates people who care for each other. So Sheryl, wonderful to see you here. I'm going to play a song for you on the Yidaki, and you're welcome to come and join me on the table.
Hi everyone, it's terrific to see you here on I think what might become a very consequential day for us all. My name's Julian Barbara, I'm the Director of the Coral Bell School of Asian Pacific Affairs, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I'd like to begin by thanking James and Paul and Sheryl. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend this respect to all First Nations people here with us tonight. I'd also like to welcome friends from the diplomatic community and from the government that are here tonight, and colleagues, students and friends. It's a very great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. This is the second Coral Bell annual lecture on Indigenous diplomacy. Indigenous peoples, of course, have a very long history of conducting international diplomacy, from their relations with one another across the continent for tens of millennia, their engagement with peoples outside of Australia, and their contributions to the current international political system. Here at the Bell School, we have a deep commitment to the study of Indigenous diplomacy and to exploring how perspectives from First Nations peoples can contribute to international relations, foreign policy, diplomacy and political thought. There's, of course, a number of important reasons for why the study of Indigenous diplomacy is important. The first concerns issues of justice and recognition. Indigenous diplomacy engages with issues of Indigenous representation, participation, nationhood and sovereignty. These are fundamentally important issues, and the more so in Australia, I think, after the voice referendum result. We have a lot of work to do. The second is the study of Indigenous diplomacy brings important and different perspectives to the challenges the world currently faces. As a school with a deep commitment to helping the nation better understand its place in the region, in Asia and the Pacific and the world, ensuring we can bring new and critical perspectives of how we engage with issues such as development, peace and conflict, climate change has never been more important. Understanding and engaging with these challenges from as many angles as possible and gaining insights from as many traditions, frameworks and perspectives as possible is critical for helping us tackle these challenges. I'd also like to note that when we talk about Indigenous diplomacy here at the Bell School, we don't just mean Australian Indigenous peoples. We also mean peoples from many other nations. And particularly important for us here is scholarship in the Bell School around oceanic diplomacy, which explores the distinctive practices and principles of Indigenous and non-Western diplomacies in the Pacific region. I'd now like to invite up to the platform Professor Helen Sullivan, the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, to say a few words before I then introduce Professor Lightfoot.
Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you, Paul. As I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region and to all First Nations Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, live and work, whose cultures are among the oldest continuing cultures in human history and, as Paul reminds us, whose land has never been ceded. As Julian indicated, this is a special event for us, the second of its kind. Indigenous diplomacy is a key initiative of the college located in the Coral Bell School. We continuously try to create opportunities for meaningful collaborations and conversations that focus on the way Indigenous diplomacy and First Nations perspectives can and should be incorporated into the ongoing discourse on regional policy, security and international relations. In July, we hosted a 3-day workshop this year to learn about the ongoing life of Indigenous sovereignties in Australia and their distinct ways of making diplomacy. This workshop, funded by our very, very, very good friends at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and developed in partnership with Charles Darwin University, and it's wonderful to see Ruth Wallace here this evening, was a great success. The workshop welcomed elders from Indigenous communities around the country, so including our local Indigenous elders. We had elders from the Ngambri peoples, but also going beyond that, we welcomed elders from the Larrakia, from the Wiradjuri, from the Moong and from the Karag. And they joined with attendees from academia, government and the policy-making community to participate in an immersive workshop. I'm just remembering this now, it was absolutely freezing when we did this. I don't know if you remember, Paul. Some of our guests were more accustomed to the very chilly Canberra weather than others, and I had a very big coat on, and I think I was going to be divested of it if we'd been stood out there for much longer. But it was a great way to start the workshop. The workshop was unique in many ways, firstly in the way it brought elders together with people from those other sectors, but particularly because it flipped the dynamic of how these things work. Indigenous peoples and elders took on the role of teachers and experts, sharing their knowledge, experience and perspectives with those who would normally be standing at the front of the room. And this format and the willingness to learn by the people who often make decisions for Indigenous communities without the knowledge of its impact or even through a collaborative approach was one of the reasons the workshop was so successful. The workshop also involved a round table on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and interactive sessions on dance and diplomacy. Again, these provided opportunities for attendees to learn and understand different perspectives on how diplomacy can be engaged with and delivered by different communities within the region. We've been hosting these workshops in partnership with Charles Darwin University and DFAT for more than 5 years now, working with elders from across the country on issues of diplomacy and politics. Our commitment to Indigenous diplomacy has resulted in the college establishing the first postgraduate course in Australia on Indigenous diplomacy and sovereignty. Offered as an intensive course, it is coordinated by James Blackwell, who is here this evening, and you've already met, and who holds the unique position of Research Fellow in Indigenous diplomacy. And at this point, I'd like to pay tribute to Tony Erskine, the previous director of the Coral Bell School, who had a great deal to do with establishing this programme. As a research fellow, James's work focuses on advancing Indigenous knowledges and perspectives into spaces within policy, higher education and international relations that have previously been built around the exclusion of Indigenous voices. James is also doing his PhD in our International Relations Department, exploring how First Nations people across this continent understand, practice and participate in diplomacy and international relations, and whether First Nations practices and knowledges can be better utilised in international relations theory and foreign policy practice. In addition, James is also a member of the Uluru Dialogue at UNSW and has worked extensively to support the Uluru Statement from the Heart by campaigning and educating communities across regional New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT during the 2023 referendum campaign. As Julian mentioned, tonight is the second Coral Bell School annual lecture on Indigenous diplomacy. This annual lecture is the first and only national event in Australia celebrating and exploring First Nations peoples and their contributions to international relations, diplomacy, foreign policy and political thought. The inaugural lecture in March 2023 was opened by Senator Penny Wong, Minister for Foreign Affairs, where she announced Australia's inaugural ambassador for First Nations people, Mr. Justin Mohammed. In this lecture, the first lecture, Dr. Mary Graham and Associate Professor Morgan Brigg explored what makes Aboriginal Australian international relations unique, what we could learn from such unique ways of knowing, being and doing, and why such approaches and worldviews are important in modern Australia. It was a wide-ranging discussion on Aboriginal Australian political ordering and relationality in international politics. And I think I'm right in saying it's still up on YouTube if you haven't seen it. It's an incredible lecture. Tonight, in our second annual lecture, we go beyond Australia's borders to explore the diplomacy of other First Nations peoples, to discover how their rights are being claimed and negotiated globally and domestically. So I'll now hand back to Julian to formally introduce our guest speaker, Professor Sheryl Lightfoot. But I would like to finish by affirming our commitment as a college and as the National University to the principles and practices of Indigenous diplomacy. Thank you all.
Thanks, Helen. Now it's my very great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Sheryl Lightfoot. Professor Lightfoot is Anishinaabe, a citizen of Lake Superior Band of the Ojibwe, enrolled at the Keweenaw Bay community. She's currently the North American member of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. At the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, she's Professor of Political Science in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, as well as Faculty Associate in the Institute for Critical Indigenous Studies. She was Canada Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics from 2013 to 2023, and between 2018 and 2023, she served as Senior Advisor on Indigenous Affairs, leading the development and implementation of the Indigenous Strategic Plan at UBC. One of the world's experts in global Indigenous politics, Professor Lightfoot's research specialises in complex questions of Indigenous peoples' rights and how those rights are being claimed and negotiated. Her work explores both practical and theoretical aspects of implementation of Indigenous rights globally and in domestic contexts. She's the author of Global Indigenous Politics, A Subtle Revolution. Prior to her academic career, Professor Lightfoot had 15 years volunteer and contract experience with a number of American Indian tribes and community-based organisations in the Minneapolis-St Paul area, including 9 years as chair of the board of the American Indian Policy Centre, a research and advocacy group. As a member of the UN Expert Mechanism, Professor Lightfoot provides the Human Rights Council with expertise and advice on the implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. The mechanism also assists UN member states in achieving the goals of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. She's the first Indigenous woman from Canada to be appointed to this prestigious position. So please join me in making Professor Lightfoot very welcome. And Sheryl, over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all very much for the tremendously warm welcome. Welcome to country. I want to also pay my respects to the people of this land, and thank you very much, not only for the welcome, but for the participation in that welcome. That's very meaningful, and I want to say thank you very much, James. And thank you for welcome to the school and to the college, and for the invitation to spend a few weeks with you here at ANU. It's not my first time to ANU. It's become somewhat of an annual event. I've been here 3 times in October in the last 3 years running, so I think it's a good tradition. We should keep that up. So I am very pleased to be with you tonight and to share some recent activity at the United Nations that I guarantee most of you have never heard of, but it's important movements that are happening, not only for Indigenous people, but for all peoples of the world that interact with global issues. So what I want to share with you tonight is how something very ordinary can become very radical when Indigenous peoples enter and aim to participate in international space. And back home in my grassroots circles, it is often said that being born Indigenous is itself a political act. And what Indigenous people in my home community mean by this is that there are changes that need to be made, and we have a responsibility to do it. Therefore, we are political. And then when we move to international spaces, we know quite well Indigenous peoples don't fit very easily. International relations, as it's commonly understood in academic theory and in practice, would typically overlook, marginalize, and sometimes even erase Indigenous peoples and nations. Indigenous peoples are typically presumed by scholars and practitioners alike to be matters of exclusively domestic concern. But when international relations theory has considered Indigenous peoples as international or global political actors, it typically will analyze them as part of a transnational social movement, which means they're the object of someone else's actions, or they might be key allies in global environmental or climate change campaigns, and again, at best, the objects of someone else's actions. So therefore, if we follow my grassroots logic from back home, everything we do as Indigenous peoples, and especially as Indigenous nations, in that international, in that state-centric world, becomes a political act, simply because changes are required and we have the responsibility to do so. What I want to share with you tonight is a particular case where we are advocating for our right to participate internationally in conversations about matters that impact us. And we are being political because, quite frankly, changes must be made in international space. Because when we attempt to do the most ordinary of things, to participate in a global conversation that are already open to others, we create change. And we're actually somewhat disruptive to the state-centric order and institutions, so we become radical. Simply because we are Indigenous people seeking to practice our inherent human rights on an equal basis with other peoples on Earth. So a quick look at the journey that we're going to take together in my time tonight. First of all, we're going to explore a little bit snapshot of how Indigenous peoples have been making change in international space, what I call the subtle revolutions. And then we'll take a little deeper dive into the current Enhanced Participation Project at the United Nations. And that's a very long project, so I'll only be able to run some of the highlights by you. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some consideration of implications, some serious challenges, current election notwithstanding, and considerations for looking forward. So the subtle revolutions. Indigenous peoples have a very long history of making change in international space. The subtle revolutions, I have called them in my own previous work. And revolutions, I don't mean this in a negative or a violent way, but rather I mean a productive, constructive interpretation, reinterpretation, because the changes that are being made are systemic, structural, in mainstream international systems, institutions, and processes that improve Indigenous peoples' participation, their agency. These revolutions are subtle because they seem to operate outside the view or the concern of mainstream international relations theory or practice until we'll get noticed. But let's hold on that, the once we are seen question for the moment, and come back to that. So Indigenous peoples have worked for many years, often many decades, to challenge both domestic and international institutions that exclude them and have done violence to them through these exclusions. And that includes both Western liberal law, states and institutions equally, alongside non-Western institutions and legal state frameworks. As my earlier work has demonstrated and documented, Indigenous peoples have been subtly making change at the UN for decades, and particularly in the human rights arena, working always to enhance their participation and enhance their agency. And Western human rights institutions have never been a perfect fit for Indigenous peoples, in part because we also had to fight against the hegemony and the superiority, both real and presumed, of Western thought and Western institutions. And those institutions have struggled, in fact, to provide an inclusive approach that simultaneously recognizes and respects the distinctiveness of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have entered those spaces and have had to navigate for change almost daily, and that not only includes them in conversations, but then also necessarily rewrites and shifts those spaces in order to accommodate Indigenous peoples, not simply as minority populations. So Indigenous peoples have utilized the structures of the human rights system with all of their problematic Western liberal origins to reshape those very structures and institutions in order to improve their own agency within those institutions. So please take a look at one of my favorite photographs from 1977. This is the very first delegation of Indigenous peoples entering the United Nations in Geneva the summer of 1977. And we will come back to this photograph in a few minutes, but this photograph is truly iconic, as it represents the very beginnings of Indigenous peoples creating change at the United Nations, simply by asserting their right to be present, their right to be included in discussions, and their right to be heard. So in the years since '77, Indigenous peoples have been making change at the United Nations in a variety of ways. And in each and every case, the ordinary behavior that they exhibit becomes radical, simply because again and again, there's not an easy fit or a comfortable fit within the state system. Indigenous peoples require change-making of systems, structures, and processes just to engage on their own terms as themselves. So Indigenous peoples have done this in several ways. First of all, a push for inclusion. But that's not unique to Indigenous peoples. There's also been a push for self-determination and self-representation as a means of self-determination. And then finally, there's been reshaping of institutions to meet Indigenous peoples' needs, principles, values, all framed as a push for self-determination. So a few examples of these changes. First and foremost, probably most obviously, was the achievement of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, the culmination of nearly 30 years of intensive work and negotiation by Indigenous peoples advocates sitting down at the table with states. This was the first human rights instrument in the history of the human rights system to be negotiated by the rights holders themselves, not merely other international agents acting on their behalf. So the UN Declaration is a standard-setting document that recognizes that Indigenous peoples, equal to all other peoples on Earth, have the inherent right of self-determination from which all other human rights flow. And with this document accepted as the global consensus standard of Indigenous peoples' rights, Indigenous peoples were finally included as distinct rights holders in the human rights system. Another example. Indigenous peoples have successfully advocated for significant rule changes at the United Nations, particularly by challenging very restrictive participation policies that limited their access and representation. Through very persistent diplomatic efforts, Indigenous representatives secured some degree of modification in certain select locations to the UN regulations that restrict attendance and speaking rights merely to NGOs with consultative status. And further, Indigenous representatives have been able to embed certain cultural protocols within official proceedings, completely against UN rules, by the way, and have been able to incorporate ceremonial openings and spiritual acknowledgements which honor Indigenous traditions, ways of being, and foster unity and respect among participants. Additionally, procedurally, Indigenous activists have introduced and normalized practices that reflect Indigenous political and cultural values, influencing, in fact, how meetings are conducted in the UN space. In certain cases, they have been able to alter the normal UN rules of procedure within Indigenous mechanisms at the United Nations to privilege Indigenous voices and also to limit the opportunity for state domination of discussions. They have introduced Indigenous decision-making processes, particularly consensus-building methods, which contrast starkly with the UN's traditional voting systems. And these reforms have allowed Indigenous delegates broader access and the right to address the different assemblies and empowering their voices within an international context typically dominated by states. Additionally, the creation of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2000 in New York, and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the body I serve on, in 2007 in Geneva, were landmark achievements driven by Indigenous advocacy. The Permanent Forum in New York provides a dedicated platform for Indigenous representatives to engage in dialogue with state actors on critical issues affecting Indigenous peoples worldwide, while the Expert Mechanism, or EMRIP for short, offers expert advice on promoting and protecting Indigenous rights. And together, these bodies institutionalize Indigenous participation at the United Nations, giving them formal avenues to influence global policy and ensuring Indigenous perspectives remain within discussions on human rights and development. Now, how is all of this work possible? The UN Voluntary Fund, in many cases, established 1985, was a pivotal development that enhanced Indigenous representation and participation at the United Nations. The fund provides financial support to Indigenous delegates, enabling them to participate in key UN meetings, such as sessions of the Permanent Forum, the EMRIP, and other international meetings like the COP. By easing the financial burden, the fund ensures a more diverse and representative presence of Indigenous voices in global discussions, particularly those from under-resourced regions. And this support has been instrumental in allowing Indigenous delegates to actively engage in international advocacy, advancing their rights, and bringing crucial perspectives to UN meetings. Now, with all of that as the background, I want to share with you a particular ongoing effort, a project, to further advance Indigenous peoples' participation in both the UN General Assembly in New York and the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And this work is based on what we could call participant observations that I've been engaging in since 2016, when I began attending and participating in various consultation meetings on enhancing Indigenous peoples' participation in the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. And I've followed this process in New York and Geneva with great interest ever since then. What's the background in this? What is the problem? What is needed? So throughout the nearly 5 decades that Indigenous peoples have appeared at the United Nations, and in multiple mechanisms and forums, only 2 paths of participation have been available to them. Indigenous people can go to the UN as representatives of the member state delegations, such as Canada or Australia, with whom they are often in conflict. And that also comes with particular restrictions, as you cannot take the floor to speak against the member state delegation if you're traveling within that delegation. Or they can be self-representing, but only as non-governmental organizations or NGOs, even if they are organized as governments, peoples, and nations. So Indigenous nations or governments have never been allowed to represent themselves in UN space. And the existing methods of participation are inadequate because Indigenous peoples coming as governments are not, by definition, non-governmental. They are governments. So in practice, what this means is that Indigenous peoples are often not in the room when decisions are made that impact them, which is a direct violation of the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, particularly self-determination and the right to participate in decision-making and free, prior, and informed consent. Now, the Charter of the United Nations, its founding document from the 1940s, begins with the words, "We the peoples of the United Nations." And while Indigenous peoples were not originally included in the "We the peoples" at the time, and the UN Declaration has attempted to remedy that exclusion, the genuine hope expressed by many Indigenous peoples over the years is that the UN can also come to be a space that will provide Indigenous nations, governments, peoples with a form of independent status and self-representation for their participation. In practice, this would mean that Indigenous groups who organize and advocate for themselves in international space without representing or being represented by states or NGOs would be a form of global political self-determination very distinct from what we currently understand as state-centric conceptions. To consider the question of how participating in a meeting, something very ordinary, becomes radical, it's helpful to take a look at Indigenous peoples' participation within the framework of individual human rights versus collective human rights. And in this diagram from my earlier work, a 2016 book, we can see that the UN Declaration is grounded in common global experiences of colonization. And then the United Nations Declaration affirms both individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples, which address those common problems of colonization. Individual rights protection for Indigenous persons produces anti-discrimination provisions, the top line, largely ordinary in legal practice. But collective rights, on the other hand, can be divided into soft and hard categories. Soft rights, which we would call culture, language, spirituality, tend to be much easier for states to implement, and they generally do not upset the status quo. However, the hard rights in the lower corner, such as land, and self-determination, and free, prior, and informed consent, are where we see the greatest state resistance to Indigenous rights implementation, as tremendous shifts can be required in state systems, structures, institutions, and processes. And as we'll see as we walk through this, the Enhanced Participation Project is looking to establish pathways by which Indigenous peoples can exercise their inherent collective rights. And participation of Indigenous peoples, as nations, and not merely as NGOs, falls under, clearly, the collective right of Indigenous peoples to self-determination. So the remainder of my presentation will lay out just how it is, ordinary, enhancing the participation is, and it is neither radical in process, nor is the result it is pursuing. But what is radical about enhancing participation is that the expectation it lays out for established systems to shift and to change to recognize the inherent rights of the inherent collective rights of Indigenous peoples creates some issues. In order to understand where the story begins, we need to go back 101 years. So in 1923, Haudenosaunee Chief Diskahe was sent by his people to what was then the brand new League of Nations in Geneva. Now, because the Haudenosaunee, which is a very large group that currently is bisected by the Canadian-US border, had signed treaties with the Dutch long before the British had arrived in North America, and they have never ceded their lands or signed any treaty to join Canada or the United States, they still consider themselves as a sovereign people, and they do not in any way, shape, or form seek representation through Canada or the United States. Now, Chief Diskahe was sent by his people to Geneva, to the League, to protest the actions of Canada and to highlight the numerous treaty violations that Canada was committing at the time. So, of course, it was logical that he traveled on travel papers from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, not from Canada, and so he did. And he traveled to Geneva and spent a year there, asking the League of Nations for speaking time. In that year, he was denied. And after that year of trying, he returned to North America. But in the time that he was in Geneva, Canada had militarily occupied Haudenosaunee lands, forcibly installed an Indian Act banned government, and attempted to disband the traditional governance system of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. They did not fully succeed, as that traditional system of government remains very much in existence, working parallel to the banned council. Sadly, Chief Diskahe never returned home, instead went into exile in the United States on that side of the border and died shortly thereafter. So back to the 1977 iconic picture that I promised. So this photo of Indigenous peoples entering the UN grounds in Geneva for the first time in some ways represents that victory over Diskahe's plight. Indigenous people, including representatives from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, are in this picture. They entered the UN and participated in the first of what would become many, many meetings at the United Nations. Further, like Diskahe before them, the Haudenosaunee delegation in 1977 did not take up Canadian or US passports, but rather they traveled to Geneva on Haudenosaunee passports. They came to the United Nations as themselves, as an Indigenous nation, and did so in the most ordinary of ways. They traveled and arrived on their nation's passport in hand, asking for speaking rights. The problem is, in 1977, as it is today, is that if Indigenous people want to speak in formal state settings as a government, they can't. They must register as either part of the Canadian or the US delegations or as a non-governmental organization or NGO. Now, for many Indigenous peoples, organizing themselves as an NGO does not present any particular difficulty. And in this photo, we see many Indigenous peoples, including Haudenosaunee, participating and speaking at the UN in an NGO capacity and using those credentials. However, if they wish to speak as a nation, there is no pathway for them to get credentials and remain a representative of their government. They must either join the settler government or take on an NGO. In 2019, and then again in 2023, the present carrier of the name Chief Diskahe went to Geneva to appear at the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where he was also denied credentials and speaking rights as a leader of his people. So this problem is now 101 years old. And here are some photos of that Chief Diskahe in the summer of 2023, in some important commemorative events for the 100th anniversary of the first Chief Diskahe's time in Geneva, seeking to represent his own people as an Indigenous government. Looking at the UN Declaration itself, there are two key articles that address this issue, Articles 18 and 19. Under Article 18, Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters that would affect their rights. And then in Article 19, it indicates that states have the obligation to consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples through their own representative institutions. So the following slides will take us through developments in the past decade or so in the current push for enhanced participation. (2013). Indigenous peoples began this deliberate, most recent campaign to address the systemic exclusion of their governments in the United Nations. In 2013, a large gathering was held in the Arctic city of Alta, Norway, hosted by the Sami Parliament of Norway. And the aim of this meeting was to set a concrete global agenda for action on the UN Declaration, and specifically in that vein, to prepare for the next year's World Conference high-level event on Indigenous peoples' rights to be held in New York in September 2014. And the outcome document from the Alta Conference addressed the problem of Indigenous nation representation in the UN quite directly. Paragraph 10 of the Alta outcome document reads, "Pursuant to the universal application of the right of self-determination for all peoples, recommends that the UN recognize Indigenous peoples and nations based on our original free existence, inherent sovereignty, and the right of self-determination in international law. We call for, at a minimum, permanent observer status within the United Nations system, enabling our direct participation through our own governments and parliaments. Our own governments include, inter alia, our traditional councils and authorities." A year later, 2014, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, a very important shift occurred. Not only were Indigenous peoples advocating for this representative status, but the UN member states also committed to making it a reality. And the World Conference in 2014 set in motion the current project, as the outcome document from that conference contains specific provisions that UN member states committed to in order to consider ways to enable the participation of Indigenous peoples in meetings of the United Nations. Following up on that commitment, a year later in the General Assembly, there was a resolution passed that required the President of the General Assembly to conduct a series of consultations with Indigenous peoples' organizations, member states, and UN mechanisms on participation, and to present a compilation of views that would form the basis of a draft text to be presented in 2017. 4 advisors were appointed by the President of the General Assembly. The permanent representatives of Finland and Ghana, along with 2 very well-known Indigenous legal experts, former Special Rapporteur Professor James Anaya from North America, and Dr. Claire Charters from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Initial consultations in 2016 and 2017 showed there to be a broad consensus that Indigenous peoples do have a right to participate in discussions and decisions. And by April 2017, the 4 advisors had drafted a resolution called the Zero Draft, which was presented again in consultation in another round to member states and Indigenous peoples during the Permanent Forum in 2017. This draft text would have begun to create a new and distinct status for Indigenous peoples at the United Nations General Assembly, a whole new category of participation. And there were 3 components at that time that remained up for discussion. Venue. Where should this right to participate occur? In the General Assembly? Some other committees? Where? Secondly, modalities and attributes. Would Indigenous people have such things as a right of reply, like member states do? Would they have a right to vote? Would they have the right to submit resolutions? Or would they have the ability to submit written statements? And then thirdly, a selection process. What sort of procedure would be in place to secure the right to participate? Who would decide? How? Using what criteria? And as you can imagine, all 3 of these areas activated vigorous discussion. Also at this stage, some problems became clear. The few UN member states that were commenting in the open meetings, and there were not many, but China, in particular for one, felt strongly that any selection mechanism must be controlled by UN member states. And Indigenous peoples, as you could expect, expressed concern that any state-driven process would limit Indigenous peoples and how they could participate, and it would enable states to discriminate against them. However, a joint statement by Canada, Australia, and New Zealand expressed satisfaction with the zero draft, and it would, as it would establish this new and distinct status, and then Norway also joined in support. Formal negotiations began in May, and at that point, Indigenous peoples were shut out of the room. There was no consensus. Some states required that state recognition of Indigenous peoples be an absolute requirement. And some states argued that there must be a state objection procedure or a veto procedure to exclude Indigenous peoples. Other states at the same time could not accept state recognition as mandatory and could not accept a state veto. But the overwhelming concern by Indigenous advocates at this juncture was that any requirements being discussed by states were in the states' only discussion. And what they were discussing would undermine potentially the existing standards so hard fought for in the UN Declaration. So at the end of this consultation, the 4 advisors forwarded a draft resolution to the President of the General Assembly to take no decision, effectively a pause, but left open the ongoing process. And while this was certainly a disappointing immediate result, it kept the issue alive without attacking Indigenous rights already affirmed by the General Assembly. So part of a regrouping and a re-strategizing effort by Indigenous peoples then involved a gathering in Quito, Ecuador. And I want to point out the date here, early 2020. This was a global Indigenous summit of sorts, which devised a new strategy that would create, that would center on the Human Rights Council in Geneva first and hold off on New York. And another result from this meeting was the creation of an Indigenous coordinating body to help facilitate regional consultation and coordination amongst Indigenous peoples with regard to this project. It was established, the body, with 2 members from each of the 7 sociocultural regions as Indigenous peoples see them. Then came the global pandemic. So in those years, we can report no progress, but also no retrenchment. Indigenous peoples, on the whole, decided that a large pause or break was preferable than trying to negotiate in an online environment. Past learnings had shown that tough negotiations with states like this required face-to-face meetings and conversations. So coming out of the pandemic, gatherings began to be possible again, and UN work returned to in-person gradually, both in New York and in Geneva. And the file on enhanced participation was picked up again first in Geneva in the Human Rights Council context. And the expert mechanism, of course also based in Geneva, has held agenda time post-pandemic for this topic in our regular meetings. There was also a meeting during the EMRIP week 2 years ago, 2022, where this was discussed as a council. In November 2022, a 4-day expert workshop was held in Geneva, hosted by the High Commission of Human Rights, where some of these outstanding details left over from New York began to be discussed concerning venue, modalities, selection mechanisms, selection criteria. Shown here on the slide is what was the landing zones, not consensus positions, but landing zones identified during the workshop on possible ways to enhance the participation. So on venue, Indigenous peoples would be able to participate in all works of the Human Rights Council based on the principles of the UN Declaration. On modalities, there was discussion that this new status for representative institutions of Indigenous peoples under the Human Rights Council should be rights-based, similar to the observer status of observer states with no right to vote, and that Indigenous peoples should be able to participate in the Human Rights Council by presenting and co-sponsoring resolutions, participating in informal negotiations, general debates, panel discussions, and also have an inverted speakers list on Indigenous peoples' issues. modifying speakers lists in order to allow Indigenous representative institutions to speak before, amongst, or immediately after the states. Selection criteria would also be rights-based and equally based on rights to self-identification, self-determination, and self-government. And Indigenous peoples' institutions must have a mandate by their own people as representative, and this had to be able to be measured by a selection mechanism using some set of criteria. State recognition, it was said, could be a factor, but should not be a requirement in selection criteria. And then criteria should be determined in a way that could not be misused by entities seeking to undermine Indigenous peoples' representative institutions. And then concerning selection mechanism, it was recommended that a newly created and independent body should serve as the selection mechanism, and that they should have decisions based on either consensus or majority. In October of 2023, so just a year ago, the Human Rights Council's annual Indigenous Peoples Resolution included more important inroads. Specifically, the Human Rights Council decided to continue to discuss and develop further steps and measures necessary to enable and facilitate the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions duly established by themselves in the work of the Council. And they decided to organize a 2-day intersessional meeting before the 2024 session and another 2-day intersessional meeting before the 2025 session in order to allow states, UN agencies, Indigenous peoples, international organizations, human rights institutions, and civil society to hold a broad dialogue on concrete ways to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples in the Council. It was also determined, this was revolutionary, that the Human Rights Council in September 2024 during its session would credential as sort of a pilot a handful of Indigenous peoples' representative institutions to participate and to speak. Now, the intersessional meetings of the Council have had 3 co-facilitators who shared facilitation duties for the 2 intersessional meetings this year. So we had Ambassador Amanda Gorley from the Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of Australia in the July session. We had Peter McDougall, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada. And then we had an Indigenous co-facilitator, Binota Moy-Demai, Asia member and former chair of the EMRIP. And I want to recognize he's in the room with us this evening. So thank you, Binota. While the ambassadors had to trade off, Binota was co-facilitator for both intersessional meetings as the Indigenous co-facilitator. So the 2 intersessional meetings were held this year, July and October, to develop concrete recommendations to the Human Rights Council on this project. Each program of work addressed the same 4 items discussed in the 2022 expert workshop. So the first intersessional in July went and did a deep dive into accreditation principles and criteria and hosted discussion around an accreditation mechanism for Indigenous peoples. And the second intersessional in October addressed the recommendations from the first intersessional and then added discussion on venues and modalities. The September 57th session of the Human Rights Council, as I mentioned, served as a type of pilot of this new status. And a badge for Indigenous peoples was issued for the very first time. And ladies and gentlemen, the sky did not fall. 101 years after Diskahe had first approached the League of Nations just down the road, the first Indigenous peoples representative spoke on the floor of the United Nations, representing her people as a government, a parliament, rather than as an NGO or as part of a state delegation. Also, parallel, update from New York, where the enhanced participation process has also been restarted, but with a little more problematic tone. So in February 24, the President of the General Assembly appointed a new set of co-facilitators, but with a familiar face, to restart the consultation processes that had been effectively paused in 2017. So Dr. Claire Charters, Maori from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Bella Kamlunas from Morocco were appointed alongside the state co-facilitators, Ambassador Bob Ray from Canada and Victor Garcia Toma from Peru. The New York process was met, and this is putting it mildly, with intense resistance by UN member states. Some who have been in these meetings even called them verbal violence. States like Russia, Algeria, Indonesia, India, to name a few, came out strongly against any such new status, using every line of resistance in their toolkit. Sadly, this highly visible New York process and the state resistance did have some spillover into Geneva, which had previously seemed to fly quite a bit under the radar of UN member states. And some of the same states that were voicing firm opposition in New York now showed up to meetings in Geneva for the first time, speaking against the process there as well. So what we see in this story is that very, very ordinary acts at the United Nations, traveling to meetings, registration, speaking time, all very ordinary things can become radical when Indigenous peoples do them. On the one hand, a non-state and non-NGO status is a very normal and ordinary reality at the United Nations. The background on this slide is a non-exhaustive list of current observers at the UN General Assembly. There are a number of groups and entities participating at the UN that are not member states and also not NGOs. So there are a handful of non-member states, like the Holy See. There are many, many intergovernmental organizations like the African Union, European Union, League of Arab States, Organization of American States, and so forth. And also numerous specialized agencies, the ILO, WHO, World Bank, IMF, WIPO, ICC. A couple personal favorites from this list, if I may. International Olympic Committee, the Knights of Malta, and a personal favorite, the International Network for Bamboo and Rattan. Meaning really bamboo and rattan. That's not symbolizing anything. So this process is about creating a new fourth category, specifically for Indigenous governments. But of course, whenever Indigenous people set out to make even a small change at the United Nations, it becomes radical, as some changes are required in how the system functions. And in this case, as we are considering Indigenous peoples as self-determining peoples, even if not as full states, it becomes a question of implementing hard rights. And as expected in hard rights cases, we encounter firm state resistance. If we take some lessons from past cases of Indigenous peoples making change at the United Nations, how is this most likely to happen? First of all, following our history, we need to find particular global allies among states and NGOs, and also be attentive that these allies at times can deviate from normal global patterns and pick them up as you can find them. Secondly, Indigenous peoples need to both play by the rules of the system to gain legitimacy and credibility, while at the same time pushing to rewrite the rules in order to change the conditions of possibility. And then thirdly, Indigenous peoples always have to play a long game, quietly, assertively, and tenaciously making change. And sometimes those biggest changes can occur just under the radar. Challenges, there are many. And as we move this process forward, a few key ones have emerged, but again, this is not an exhaustive list. In order to be globally inclusive, the processes and the considerations for participation must accommodate and support the vast diversity of Indigenous peoples around the world. So this includes huge differences in representative institutions, governments, and especially traditional authorities, both across regions and within regions. as well as big regional differences in how we use language and cultural practices to describe these institutions. Secondly, and of deep concern to many, is that one of the big wins for Indigenous peoples in the original negotiations for the UN Declaration was resisting state calls for a restrictive definition of Indigenous peoples. And this omission of a definition was deliberate on the Indigenous side and significant because Indigenous identities are so diverse and context dependent, and particularly across regions like Asia and Africa, where historical and cultural and social factors vary widely and certainly vary from the North American, Australia, or New Zealand experience. And the lack of formal definition within the Declaration allows for self-identification and inclusivity, accommodating the unique histories and contexts of peoples worldwide. States, on the other hand, have always wanted a definition. And one big challenge in this process of enhancing participation is that sometimes we can run dangerously close to states requiring a definition. And in fact, many states who are, I would call, medium to high level hostile to the process are calling for a definition, or at a very minimum, state recognition and a veto, which could imply a definition. And then something that's recently popped up is a gender-based critique of the process. And this has showed up in a few different spaces, and I think it warrants some attention. And I've heard some Indigenous women on the floor voicing that an exclusive focus on governments, Indigenous governments, where they're concerned globally, leadership overwhelmingly privileges male political authority, creates potentially a gender imbalance that needs attention. And as Sami scholar Rauna Kuokkanen argues, an emphasis on self-determination within Indigenous political movements can sometimes mask gender issues, allowing structures that perpetuate male domination to remain unchallenged under sovereignty. And some have said that this is particularly evident in the very visible male role within the leadership of the enhanced participation movement itself. Although women are clearly involved, and I know many, the key leadership roles, visible roles, continue to be held by men. And so this gender imbalance, the optics of it certainly, is a crucial factor to consider. As Indigenous peoples pursue self-determination, there is a risk, and work needs to be done here, that it could also unintentionally reinforce gender-based and other forms of discrimination. And then fourth, and probably the largest elephant in the room, global geopolitics. All of this project is happening at an extremely difficult time for global politics more broadly. We are seeing alignment among states along current fractures in the global order on other issues, suggesting a degree of cross-pollination of geopolitics into the process. Friendly states for enhanced participation, which is generally the liberal democratic order of the Kansas states, meaning Kansas, Australia, New Zealand, US, plus Europe, together with a large majority of Latin America, are lined up in support. And then Russia, China, India, Iran, and a growing group of like-minded countries, as they call it, are pushing back against the Western liberal order, and thus, by extension, the Enhanced Participation Project, since it's supported by the Western liberal states. So as we saw in New York a few months ago, and then seeping into Geneva in September, Russia, China, India, Iran, and other members of this like-minded group view enhanced participation as a significant threat to perhaps their sovereignty or to the UN system itself. And in their minds, it is clear that Indigenous peoples' enhanced participation is a hard right claim that is just too radical to be seriously considered. So as this global balance of power is shifting under our feet into a relatively new alignment, particularly as this new axis increasingly coalesces and aligns against the West, the project risks itself becoming a victim of these shifting winds. But let's not get depressed, because even with these risks and challenges, we are still looking at a very real possibility of substantial benefits for Indigenous people as well as the entire global community. As Mohawk diplomat Kenneth Deere has often said in the UN space, we're not here to cause problems. We're here to be part of the solutions to our global problems. And the knowledge that Indigenous peoples hold globally is crucial to addressing some of today's most complex issues, including climate change. And currently, this knowledge only funnels to the United Nations via a small handful of willing state governments and NGOs, and not from Indigenous peoples speaking in their own right. In addition, enhanced participation is an actionable demonstration of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Commitment to enhanced participation happens in recognition of the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council's commitments to upholding self-determination for Indigenous peoples. And for Indigenous peoples, this project and alignment with the Declaration provides avenues for us to have our rights recognized and to have our voices heard in multitude of matters that impact us. And because it is a process committed to flexible and inclusive participation in the UN, it also provides Indigenous peoples with the opportunity to determine our own priorities according to our own needs, values, and aspirations. Indigenous peoples' priorities are wide-ranging, and enhanced participation offers the possibility to influence global directives pertaining to food security, economic policy, land use, language preservation, biodiversity. The list is literally endless. So what's next? In Geneva, the next step is to receive the report from the 2 intersessional meetings, so Benota, we're looking at you, and then prepare the groundwork for a resolution in the Council to bring about the new status. In the meantime, the most recent Human Rights Council Indigenous resolution included provisions to continue to include Indigenous peoples in the Indigenous specific sessions of the Council in September, with room in the language for an ongoing process that need not be renegotiated year after year after year. So the pilot lives. New York will eventually need to resume. Ideally, we can find a way to move forward Geneva and return to New York without igniting such deep fissures in global politics, and without framing Indigenous participation as a profound threat to the existing international order. Because today, maybe today more than any day, something as simple, something as ordinary as the right to participate in a UN meeting has been transformed into a radical act. So I want to say thank you for listening. I know listening to UN procedures is enough to put people to sleep. So I hope you see the arc of the story and the real impact that is going on, and you are leaving here with much more awareness of this particular issue. So thank you very much for your attention.